You guys have heard of bicarbonate, right?
Yes.
HCO3, that's the abbreviation for bicarbonate levels. And we actually test for this when we test for electrolytes in chemistry. It's sodium, potassium, chloride, and then it's supposed to be the third one is bicarbonate level, okay? But what it's responsible for, the main function of bicarbonate is to buffer our blood. Yeah. Keeps it at 7.4. The problem is, all right, and the reason that I want to talk about this is that the problem is every bit of your bicarbonate gets filtered in the glomerulus. And you remember what I told you, if it gets filtered, it's like glucose, right? It's sitting here, and it's like, it's going to end up being excreted as urine. So if all the bicarbonate gets filtered, what's going to buffer the blood, right?
Okay.
So that bicarbonate has to be reabsorbed.
Yep, it's got to get back into the bloodstream. The only problem is it's not as easy for bicarbonate to just automatically be reabsorbed, okay? There's some magical stuff that has to happen in your body. And one of these magical things, now we're going to start talking about secretion. Something has to be secreted from the blood, okay, to enter the filtrate to change bicarbonate to another substance, all right, that can be broken down, and when it's broken down, it will move back into the blood, okay? The secretion is known as a hydrogen ion. There has to be a hydrogen ion that comes from the paratubular blood. It goes into the actual tubular filtrate. It combines with HCO3 to, I think it becomes carbonic acid, H2, if I can see it, it's going to become H2CO3, and I believe that's by carbonic acid. You guys agree the only difference between that and that is there's an extra hydrogen, okay? That extra hydrogen comes, it has to be secreted from the paratubular capillaries, and it goes into the filtrate to combine with HCO3, all right? Okay, so under acid-base balance, this is what I would highlight if I was you, if you want to understand it, then I'll show you the picture.
What page?
I'm on page 46. I'm on the third line down on page 46. Third line down on page 46 says the buffering capacity of the blood depends on bicarbonate ions, which are readily filtered by the glomerulus, and they must be returned to the blood to maintain the proper pH. As shown in figure 3-8, the secretion of a hydrogen ion by the renal tubular cells into the filtrate prevents the filtered bicarbonate from being excreted in the urine and causes the return of a bicarbonate ion to the plasma. So let's look on page 46. I want you to look at figure 3-8. Don't pay attention to anything else but figure 3-8. Okay, as you're looking at that picture, I want you to look at the top left-hand corner. Do you see that bicarbonate got filtered? See where it says that? HCO3 filter. Everybody with me on page 46? Okay, so what that's saying is the HCO3 went through the glomerulus, so it's in the tubular lumen now. But now look, do you see where in that little pink box in the middle, that's actually in between the plasma and the tubular lumen. That's called the renal tubular cells. That's like the lining of one of these. You with me? It's like the lining. You're going to have secretion occur where there's going to be a hydrogen ion that is going to combine with that bicarbonate to become H2CO3, that's carbonic acid. Now, that carbonic acid is going to be broken down into, you won't have to remember this, but it's going to be broken down to water and carbon dioxide, and basically it's going to go back across the membrane, and then it's actually, the whole cycle is going to occur all over again. And you see where the end product, what is the major importance of this picture that you're looking at? As you're looking at that picture, look at the right-hand left column. See how it's yellow? See that bicarbonate ion being put back into the paratubular plasma. You guys see that?
The HCO3.
That's the whole point. The HCO3 that was originally filtered goes through this process and it is returned back into the blood because you gotta have that in the blood. So pretty much all the bicarbonate that gets filtered is returned to the blood so it can maintain the buffering function of it, all right? Now, when we talk about chemistry, when we start talking about arterial blood gases, sometimes the body can turn this on and turn this off depending upon if it needs to buffer the blood. Because sometimes our blood becomes acidic and sometimes it becomes alkaline. So the body sometimes won't do, it'll go one way or the other with this to maintain the buffering capacity. But that pH is supposed to be maintained at 7.4. All right, the next thing we're gonna talk about is we gotta talk about, everybody got this thing of blood flow? So 3 of the things that I've talked about today, I've talked about filtration. You guys tell me what on the nephron is involved in filtration. Good, the glomerulus, right? And then we talked about reabsorption. Secretion. So what I'm gonna do, and I'm gonna try to make it simple, but I'm gonna give you like one major test that we do in the laboratory that will test the filtration capacity of the glomerulus, another one that will test how well is reabsorption taking place in the nephron, okay? And then another one, this is a rare test, I've never did this one, but there is a test also that can determine how well is the secretory capacity of the nephron. How well can substances go from the blood and put stuff into the filtrate, okay? The first one we're gonna talk about, what is a test that can measure filtration? Even though the book is gonna give you like 3 different tests, I want you to remember one. It's called a creatinine clearance, okay? A creatinine clearance. The whole goal of this is to be able to tell a physician how well is this person's kidneys filtering the blood. Okay, if you will, on page 47, there's another spot I want you to highlight in your book before we start talking about this creatinine clearance. On page 47, left-hand column at the top, see where it says glomerular filtration test? I want you to drop down to the 4th line at the very end. It says to ensure that glomerular filtration is being measured accurately. The substance that you're measuring must be one that is neither reabsorbed nor secreted by the tubules. And all that's meaning, that's just a complex way of saying, look, I want to measure something that when it goes through the glomerulus, it goes all the way through the nephron, okay? It doesn't get here and start going into the peritubular capillaries, and it's not something that's in the peritubular capillaries that's going to come back into the filtrate. It is something that gets filtered that for the most part gets excreted in the urine, okay? Now, when you read this in your book, there's different things. There's like beta-2 macroglobulin, there's radioisotopes, there's lots of different things they can use to measure filtration. But I don't want to have you learn all 4 or 5 of those where you don't remember any of them. But a creatinine clearance test is the one test that I know they do all the time in the laboratory. They come down in these jugs and it'll say creatinine clearance. There's even a calculation that we have to do this test, and I'm gonna have to give that to you guys, all right? So that's the one example I want you to give me for filtration test is the creatinine clearance. It is the most common test. I'm trying to spell it. Anyway, I'm close enough. All right, creatinine clearance. The first thing, if you're really interested in this, you should be saying, well, what's creatinine? How come it gets filtered? Like you just brought this up, so what's the deal with it? Creatinine is a breakdown of muscle. We build muscle every day, right, in our body. Our muscles break down, they build. They break down, they build. Creatinine is a metabolism product of muscle breakdown. Since it's a product of muscle breakdown, that is an endogenous substance. So that means we don't have to go get injected with something, okay, that's going to run through our body like an exogenous product. This is something that's naturally occurring at all times. So if we can figure out how much creatinine is in our blood versus how much creatinine is in our urine over a 24-hour period, we can figure out basically what the creatinine level is, how much is getting filtered in milliliters per minute, okay? That's the units on a creatinine clearance, like 116 milliliters per minute is being filtered by the kidney of your creatinine level, okay? That's the best example I can give you of a test that measures filtration. Okay, so we learned the academic part of it, but I want you to see it in your head, like, okay, you'll do this calculation, you'll memorize the formula, you'll be able to do it. But let's think it through to where, okay, why is this important and why is it a big deal that I learn it? If your body's muscles breaking down in creatinine, if it's not getting filtered through your kidneys, that means it's staying in your blood, okay? Anything that doesn't eventually get excreted the way it should do is gonna build up the toxic levels in your blood, right? Anything. So, basically, so much needs to get filtered, there is a normal range, all right? If your creatinine level, if not much of it is getting filtered, that means it's going to be, in other words, it's kind of proportional to your blood level. If you're not excreting it in the urine, it's gonna get really, really high in your blood level, okay? So in order to calculate a creatinine clearance, I can't find a good formula in your book for this, but I want you, this is one case I want you to use my formula for this, all right? Because it'll work every time. Write this down on a piece of paper if you will. Creatinine clearance is urine creatinine times or multiplied by urine volume in milliliters divided by serum creatinine times 1440.
Serum creatinine, what now?
Yeah, I'm gonna write them.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I should.
Did you catch that?
What's that?
You're gonna write it.
Urine creatinine times serum volume. I'm gonna read this. Urine creatinine times urine volume. The volume has to be in milliliters, okay? Divided by serum creatinine times 1440. This number right here, 1440, is how many minutes there are in 24 hours. Okay? That's why that number never changes.
What does that see
Urine
again?
creatinine times urine volume. The volume has to be in milliliters divided by serum creatinine times 1440. Now, I'm not trying to make this confusing, but you remember how I was telling you guys in chemistry they can do a creatinine on serum or plasma, right? You know, the supernatant. So technically, this serum creatinine can also be a plasma creatinine. Either or, whatever's given to you in the problem. You will have one of these problems on your exam, okay, where you have to do this formula. Urine creatinine times urine volume in milliliters divided by serum or plasma creatinine times 1440. This number will never change, all right? That's the creatinine clearance formula that I need you to know. If we have time, there's a problem in the back of your book, and we'll do one together and see if we get the right result, okay? Okay, a creatinine clearance. They're usually collected in these jugs like this, all right? Now, because creatinine is a metabolite of muscle breakdown, when you're at work or as a student, if you are ever having to do a creatinine clearance, your computer will not give you a final result unless, and they normally do this up on the floor, they want to know the age of the patient, they have to know the height of the patient, they also have to know the weight of the patient, okay? Because a big person is going to have more creatinine because of muscle breakdown than a smaller person, okay? Now, there is a general rule of thumb that they have what's called a normal person's body mass index, which is like calculated at 1.73. Sometimes they'll just put that in the calculation, but they still have to know the gender, the height, the weight, and all of that has to be in the calculation. I have done these before on the computer and plugged in all this information, and then when I go to result it, you should be able to hit enter and everything come up and it says lacking patient demographics. Then you have to call the floor and say, look, I don't know what's going on, but you didn't put in all the information. It won't calculate until you put in all this information. And then they'll put it all in and then your result will work, okay? Okay, so we need to talk about some errors that can happen. We are gonna have a complete chapter in chemistry talking about creatinine clearance and all this stuff. But I just want to tell you the most common error that is made in a creatinine clearance, it doesn't have to do with somebody screwing up that calculation or anything. It's how the 24-hour urine is collected. It's real important that those nurses explain to the patients, you're not going to be required to know it right now. But for example, when you start a 24-hour urine, like let's say we're going to start it at 7 o'clock in the morning, that patient is supposed to be told at 7 o'clock in the morning, you don't void into this jug. You actually void out everything in your bladder that you possibly can at 7 o'clock in the morning. It does not go in this jug. Then you start collecting from there on for the next 24 hours. So if somebody doesn't listen and they go, oh, I've been drinking coffee since 5 o'clock, and they fill this jug up to here at 7, it's going to be inaccurate. Everything is going to be inaccurate because they have improperly collected the 24-hour urine. You with me on that? That's the number one error, and it'll tell you that in your book.
So the number one error is including that first morning urine?
Yeah, if you will, on page 47, look at the very last paragraph on page 47, the very first line. Under procedure, it says, by far the greatest source of error in any clearance procedure using urine is the use of improperly timed urine specimens. In other words, the patient collected it wrong. Because you can do this at home. See what I'm saying? Sometimes these patients are told to do this at home. Will you ever be the one given the directions? Probably not. But if you happen to work at a nephrologist clinic or something, you never know. They may cross-train you to where you are giving the patients instructions on how to collect it. Page 48, I just want to show you where the normal ranges are. Kind of bear with me on this. Look in the left-hand column on page 48, go down to the very last paragraph in the left-hand column. It says, knowing that in an average person, the approximate amount of rate produced per minute is 120 mils. It says it's not surprising that a normal creatinine clearance value approaches 120 milliliters per minute. And then it says men should be around 107 to 139, women should be anywhere from 87 to 107. Usually, not always, they're not really worried about the number being too high, they're worried about it being low. Because if it's low, it means your body's not filtering substances. Think about, like, let's just say the majority of all your glomeruli and the majority of all the nephrons, think of them as being like real thick or whatever, and stuff is not passing through that sponge. It's getting trapped, and because it's getting trapped, it's not going out as urine, so it's backing up and it's staying in the blood. That makes sense to everybody, kind of, sort of? Okay, page 49, the very last paragraph on page 49 says, what is the clinical significance of these filtration rate tests? Page 49, the very last paragraph on page 49. Says, when you interpret the results of a creatinine clearance test, the filtration rate is determined not only by the number of functioning nephrons, but also by the functional capacity of these nephrons. In other words, even though half of the nephrons may be non-functional, a change in the glomerular filtration rate will not occur if the remaining nephrons are doing double time to filter things. Now, when you go on to read the rest of that, basically what that is saying is that you are not going to catch early kidney damage by doing a creatinine clearance. Usually, if they are doing a creatinine clearance on a patient, they generally already know they have major kidney damage, and they are doing this test maybe to see if, how well their body's responding to medication. You see what I mean? A creatinine clearance is not going to detect early kidney damage. But I'm fixing to talk about a test that does detect early kidney damage. I'm not saying it in every case, but you can just about bet if they're doing a creatinine clearance on a patient, usually that patient has significant kidney damage already. All right, but now we're gonna talk about a test that can determine the reabsorption capability. Now we're talking about in the nephron right here, like how well is the glucose molecules being reabsorbed back into the peritubular capillaries? Remember how we said the story about the diabetic and all these molecules have to be reabsorbed? There is a test that can determine how concentrated the urine is, and therefore that's proportional to how well reabsorption is taking place, okay? Now, a lot of you may not have heard, I think a lot of you probably heard of this creatinine clearance test, or you will hear of it when you go to clinicals, but there is a test, and if you don't work in a lab, or you're not a phlebotomist or something, you've never heard of it, but it's called an osmolarity test. They call them a urine osmo, or a serum osmo, okay? But it is an example of how you can determine the reabsorption capability of the kidney. I'm on page 50. Page 50, under tubular reabsorption tests, that very first section there says, whereas measurement of the filtration rate is not a useful indication of early renal damage, the loss of tubular reabsorption capability is often the first function affected in kidney disease. This is not surprising when one considers the complexity of the tubular reabsorption process. Again, we're talking about how well are analytes or things that got filtered and reabsorbed into the bloodstream. If we can catch that early enough, then we can tell, hey, we need to watch this patient, because if they don't change, or if we don't get them in the right diet or medication, they're gonna have it. So you can bet if you're a diabetic, they're probably gonna do periodically an osmolarity test on you to see, hey, how well is the reabsorption capability working in the kidney? And a good example of that, when you read this section, is gonna be a urine osmolarity test. Do you remember, I think I said it in chemistry, remember those colligative properties we talked about, where the more concentrated a substance is, it lowers the freezing point, remember it increases the boiling point, remember the vapor pressure, osmotic pressure? Those are all things that are called colligative properties. So what they will do, I'll just leave it at this, what they'll do is to determine how concentrated your urine is, they're gonna take that urine sample. What they're interested in is sodium and chloride molecules. They're not really interested in urea or glucose molecules. They're interested in sodium and chloride molecules. They'll take that urine sample and they're gonna see how cold do they have to get it in order for that urine to freeze. Does that make sense? Kind of like the radiator fluid that I always go back to. All right, if you have antifreeze in your radiator, it has to get a lot colder to freeze it, right?
Right.
But if you put water in your radiator, it's gonna freeze,
Right.
right? That's the concept of a urine osmo. The more concentrated the urine is, the colder it's gonna have to get in order to freeze that urine. Now that's as simple as I can make it as far as how that test works. Now, if you want to read about that, that's on page 51 under what an instrument that's called a freezing point osmometer on page 51. Do all of you see that section? Okay, so if I ask you an example of a test that measures reabsorption, I want you to tell me a osmolarity test or a urine osmo. If I ask you a test that measures filtration rates, I want you to tell me a creatinine clearance. Now there's one more, I'll go ahead and tell you this is not on your test because I don't even feel comfortable teaching about it because I've never actually did it, okay? But there is a test that can measure the secretion capability of the kidney, and it is called a PAH test, and this is on 52. And that PAH stands for para-aminohypuric acid test. Now, when you read this section, again, I read it last night and this morning, basically, they give you an exogenous substance, and this substance is going to lightly stick to proteins, certain proteins in your blood. Now, I'm not a pharmacist, I probably can't even answer many questions about this, But the way I see it is they can inject you with this substance. It's going to, they know for whatever reason, it sticks to certain proteins. Remember, your proteins don't get filtered, right? They stay in here. So what it is this substance is, your book is gonna tell you it's loosely bound to the proteins. So when it gets over here, it's monitoring how quick can that substance go from here and get in the filtrate. You see what I mean? Like how well that operation is working in your kidneys. So it's measuring secretion. I do remember the test because we used to send it out all the time, and I didn't even know what the letters stood for, but it was a PAH test. What did I call it? Para-aminohypuric acid test. But that, all I would do, read over it for your information, but just know if you see it in a multiple choice question, that's an example that monitors secretion, not reabsorption.
Don't you close the door?
And the test for reabsorption was osmolarity.
Yeah. All right, we'll go over to whatever time we've got left. If you guys will, in your book, turn to page 54. Let's do that creatinine clearance, see if we get the right result for this. And you guys need to make sure that you can do this number 20 on page 54. It says, given the following information, calculate the creatinine clearance, all right? It says a 24-hour urine volume of 1,000 milliliters. Everybody with me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It says the serum creatinine is 2 milligrams per deciliter. The urine creatinine is 200 milligrams per deciliter. Okay. So now I'm not going to have my book. You guys, let's do it on the board. Okay. What was the urine creatinine?
It's gonna be 200 milligrams per deciliter.
Say it again.
200 milligrams per deciliter.
200.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we're going to have 200. I'm not going to put the units because that confuses
Okay.
me.
Times 1,000.
Times how many milliliters?
1,000.
Okay,
Yeah.
1,000. Okay, now guys, right here, before we go any further, I'm just telling you, a lot of problems on registries and stuff, they put this in liters because they want to know, do they know enough about this equation to know they have to put it in milliliters?
Okay.
Because if you do it in liters, you're going to get the wrong result. Okay, so just remember, if it says in this problem it's 1 liter, you have to know to change 1 liter to 1,000 milliliters. So do we have the top part of the equation
Yes.
satisfied? Okay. What is the serum creatinine?
2.0 milligrams per deciliter.
2,
Yes, sir.
okay, times 1440. That number never changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is how many minutes are in 24 hours. So somebody do that on your calculator. 200 times 1,000. That's 1,000. Divided by 1440, that's what, 2880?
69.4.
69.4. Remember your units, milliliters per minute. I can tell you right now, that's not good. That's not a good number. I mean, no, you're all right. You got the right answer, but that's not a good number.
To confirm the unit milliliters per minute.
Yeah, milliliters per minute. Yeah, sometimes I don't write the big L for whatever reason.
I put milliliters.
No, not millimeters, milliliters. That's the right answer, okay?
How come they're not giving it even any options in here?
Because that's one of the few questions that's not multiple choice. But if you look in the back of the book, it'll give you the answer, and I think that's right.
Is that the right sig fix?
Say that again?
Oh, let's talk about significant figures. You know, Stephanie, I'm all on that sig fix. It's 2.0.
So is
Okay, guys, I know I gave you a bunch of information today, but I will tell you a good study guide, and I don't say this a lot because I'm not big on PowerPoints, but if I gave you too much information, brain overload or whatever, look at your PowerPoints, because I went pretty close by them. Actually, your PowerPoints just give you a little bit too much information, in my opinion. If you'll look at your PowerPoints answers your objections too, but I've already looked at the test. already, and I hit on things that I know are on the test, okay? So if you highlighted it in your book, study it.
Yes, sir.
All right, and we'll give a review next week, but, not trying to sound like a broken record, but guys, keep up, because you're not feeling it yet, but starting next Friday, you're gonna be looking at each other like, oh my gosh, look what we were fixing to have coming. You're gonna have 4 tests coming at you at the same time, basically, and the same probably within a week of each other. So be prepared for that.
And then if